Beyond the edge of reality lies a story of ultimate conquest, a story of war and friendship, a story of a love that can never be, and a hatred that always was. And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. Final Fantasy VII.
PlayStation.
For me, it's crazy to think that it's been 17 years since the release of Final Fantasy VII. It's been that long since I sat down in my parents' basement in front of the TV, in front of the PlayStation 1, and just tore into that 3-disc spectacular that was Final Fantasy VII. I loved it, my younger brother loved it, and we played the crap out of the thing, and I can't believe that much time has passed. It's just crazy.
The first time I saw Final Fantasy VII, I believe I saw a TV commercial of it. Also, we were getting the PlayStation demo discs, and I believe there was a video demo, not the actual playable demo, of the game. The graphics were just amazing.
More than 200 animators and programmers. A multi-million-dollar production. Over 2 years in the making. And a cast of thousands. They said it couldn't be done in a major motion picture. They were right. Final Fantasy VII.
PlayStation.
Final Fantasy VII marked the first time that a lot of North American players would be really digging into a Japanese RPG. For me, that wasn't the case. I was very familiar with RPGs and loved them. I played the original Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Entertainment System, was a big fan of Dragonware games, Dragon Quest games, and obviously when we got to the 16-bit era, being on the Super Nintendo side of things, I was very familiar with Final Fantasy II, otherwise known as Final Fantasy IV in Japan, and Final Fantasy III, otherwise known as Final Fantasy VI in Japan. 3/6 is one of my all-time favorite games on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I begged my parents to get it for me for my birthday. So Final Fantasy VII wasn't my first rodeo in terms of Final Fantasy games, but for me, it was the first Final Fantasy game I wasn't really interested in because I was far and away done with consoles at that point and just into PC gaming, playing, first-person shooters like Doom and Heretic and Hexen, and I had no interest in Final Fantasy VII whatsoever until something arrived at my doorstep. So I get home from a school day and I go to the mailbox and I pull the mail out, and there's this VHS cassette marked the Squaresoft Collector's Video, and Final Fantasy VII is predominantly featured on the front of it. And I was like, okay, I knew Final Fantasy VII was coming out. I wasn't super interested in it, but hey, it's always cool to get free stuff in the mail. I'm going to go ahead and pop this in. And I popped the tape in, and I sat and was just blown away at the barrage of different CGI cutscenes that they were throwing in at you and letting you see. And, like I said, I was a PC game player, and there was nothing on PC that really looked like this or played like this, that played like a Final Fantasy game to me, and this just looked spectacular. So going through and watching that VHS tape and watching the interviews with all the different creators, the musicians and everything that put the game together, definitely piqued my interest for what Final Fantasy VII was and planted the seed, if you will, to start making me want to pick up a PlayStation and get back into console gaming. I went to a Christian junior high school, and video games were not high on the list of priorities for them to be playing, so I didn't have too many people to talk video games with. You know, some students were not allowed to play video games at all by decree of their parents, or if they were, they had a lot of the older stuff, like, you know, the Nintendo Entertainment System stuff that they were playing. They really didn't have any experience with the 16 or 32-bit game systems. So I found it interesting that the first time that I heard about Final Fantasy VII in a schoolyard environment was from the principal. Every morning we would have a assembly and the principal would talk about something kind of like a life lesson. I don't know if she was talking about that video games were bad or too much of a good thing is bad for you, you know, whatever. But she was talking about, you know, it was late at night and her sons were in the bedroom playing a video game that she just got them, and they were playing for hours. And she opened the door to tell them to go to bed, and instead she found both her sons collapsed on the floor, gripping the PlayStation controller, and they were fast asleep. And that game they were playing was Final Fantasy VII. So right away I knew it had addictive qualities to it, and that made sense since Final Fantasy VI was pretty addictive. But it's funny just hearing it from a principal, especially because video games are kind of taboo where I was at, and it ended up being that her son played so much of this game he ended up passing out. I didn't get my PlayStation until April or May of 1998. So, you know, I graduated junior high school by that point. Summer was just starting, and we finished a bunch of different games, Castlevania, Resident Evil, and other games. And I recalled, oh yeah, that's right, Final Fantasy VII's on the PlayStation. So I called my friend up, the same friend who fell asleep at the hands of Final Fantasy VII, and asked, hey, do you mind if I come over and grab that game from you, borrow it for a couple weeks and check it out? And he said, yeah, sure, no problem. So I got on my bike, rode 3-4 miles over to his place and picked up that game, brought it home, and man, did that start a summer of fun with myself and my little brother, tearing through that game, getting all the extras, all the secrets, grinding to build up experience points so we could fight Sephiroth in the end. Just a great time. And it's funny because he never got that copy of Final Fantasy VII back. At least I don't think he did. It went through 2 or 3 people. I gave it to a friend of mine who gave it to a friend of his that went back to a friend of mine. And I don't know if David ever got his game back. So if he happens to be watching this, I'm really sorry that you never got your game back. But hey, thanks for letting me borrow it.
An evil empire is sucking the life force from the planet, destroying all that's in its path. It's up to one soldier of fortune to save the world. If he succeeds, you survive. If he fails, you can always hit the reset button. Final Fantasy VII.
PlayStation.
You know, it's hard to pick just one memory that's great about Final Fantasy VII because even though the game is 17 years old, it still has some great gameplay elements to it, some great sequences. If I had to pick a favorite moment, it's probably when Sephiroth just lays waste to the town that Tifa grew up in and burns down the city, burns down the reactor, and there's just that really epic moment, that CGI cutscene where there's flames and it's just a blazing inferno everywhere, and in front of it is Sephiroth, and he just walks into the flames, takes one look at you, and walks into the flames. Epic.
I would have to say my favorite scene was when Cloud was on the motorcycle in the Shinra Mansion. He breaks through the window and he looks like a total badass while he's doing it, and they're trying to escape from the Shinra Mansion.
最終的にはそんなに表に出てないと思うんですけどね。
When we were creating Final Fantasy III, my mother passed away. And ever since, I have been thinking about the theme, life. Life exists in many things. And I was curious about what would happen if I attempted to analyze life in a mathematical and logical way. Maybe this was my approach in overcoming the grief I was experiencing. This is the first time in the series that this particular theme actually appears in the game itself. See if you can spot it.
Final Fantasy VII was one of the first, well, it was the first Final Fantasy out on PlayStation. So the fact that it had 3D graphics was, totally different from playing Final Fantasy on the Super Nintendo. The characters were just absolutely cool. The graphics, the storyline itself was very intriguing with what was going on with the world, and kind of leaves you hanging at the very end of the game as to what happens. So I think just great story, great characters, and the graphics at the time just were totally mind blowing.
7 CD ロムになって大きな変化っていうのは
The most significant difference to us was capacity. Before, we were given restrictions in capacity, so we had to create one basic model and fiddle around with it, making players believe there were variations. It was a good way to become resourceful in limited circumstances. But on the CD-ROM, that restriction was completely taken away, and we didn't have to worry about various ways of modifying one basic model. If we needed 100 models, we could create each of them from scratch. The basic concept you have when creating RPGs is to imitate the real world and create a fictional world within the game. We have followed that concept in previous versions of this series, but technically, we had to use one basic model in different ways, or use a world symbolized specifically for game use. Now it is much easier for us to achieve our original goal. We can now express more of the real world in the game.
これまでのファミコン、スーパーファミコンの時は全体の
The number of simultaneous music output channels used to be 8 in the Super NES. Now it's 24. We leave 8 of them open for sound effects, so we have 16 to use for the actual music. That adds a lot of richness to the music. For example, when you hit the piano keys with both of your hands, you get 10 notes at once, and you won't be able to create that kind of a sound on Super NES. Suppose we create that piano-type sound with 10 notes, and you still have 6 notes left. This means you can fit in sounds of other instruments, and this certainly adds complexity to the game.
ですね、今回に関してもコンピュータグラフィックスの技術っていうのを2通りのパターンとしてゲーム中に
We were able to use 2 types of CG technology in this game. One is the movie technology, where you create motion pictures using CG software and store it on CD-ROM. The other is polygon-based technology, where you create 3D objects and make them move. It is amazing to see new images being generated one after another, and all being played smoothly on the game console. You realize how powerful current technology is.
ロムから CD ロムになってだんだん今までは
Thanks to CD-ROM, cinematic expressions which were impossible in the past have become available. For example, we can now show close-ups on characters' faces, and using various camera angles, the game screen is no longer a stage-like space. However, movies can be seen in movie theaters. In order to make this thing attractive to game players, we tried hard to put playable elements in the scenarios. We made it so players will not have to follow our pace.
The music really suited what was going on. I mean, as far as the battle music and the different areas that you went into, the caves, they kind of had this, eerie sound to it. When something sad would happen, the music was very touching and suited the situation. The battles with Sephiroth, very intense, world is ending kind of tone to it. So it was very, very impressive with the way that they were able to orchestrate all the music and put it to each scene. They did a very good job doing that.
フィールドを歩く時の曲が
The music in the field scenes, which is where the character walks around, has a unique flavor that no other RPGs had in the past. We intentionally eliminated the up-tempo, inspiring, rousing type of feel, meant to encourage you to embark on a journey that usual RPGs have. Instead, some parts of the music will rise melodiously. Some parts will make you feel insecure, therefore creating various expressions within the same field of music. I assume players will get a different feel from it compared to previous RPGs. To tell the truth, I hope so, since this is my own experiment.
I'd say if they were to do anything, remake the game and do the full-blown HD graphics. If you were to do an X2, I guess it could be similar to what they did with the Advent Children movie. But you don't want to take something that is epic on its own and really expand too much on it, because you kind of, it turns more into a let's just make money off of this. Unless they did a really good job with expanding on the story, I would say just remake the original.
Final Fantasy VII is definitely one of those games that will hold the test of time, and Square knows it because they keep putting it across various platforms. They re-released it on PC, so you can play it on Steam again. It's available for download on PSN. There's been a feature movie with it. There's been a small anime released with it. There's stuff all over about Final Fantasy VII merchandise, but I find it funny that the major request that has not been answered by Squaresoft, that the fans keep begging for, is a re-release, an HD re-release of Final Fantasy VII. And some say that it's never going to happen, and modders have gone out of their way to actually mod all the polygons and make them look HD. It's interesting. Do I personally think there will ever be a Final Fantasy VII remake? I think so. I think when the time is right, we're going to see it, and it's going to be awesome. But for now, Square's mum about it. But all in all, Final Fantasy VII is a fantastic game, and can't wait to talk about it again when it reaches its 20th birthday. Happy birthday, Final Fantasy.
Final Fantasy VII, to me, is the best Final Fantasy game ever. Ever.